Okay, so you're back with us again, which means you're probably the kind of person who likes to really, get to the hard things.
Yeah, someone who likes to understand, the really major shifts that are happening without getting lost in, just endless scrolling and feeling overloaded by, just too much information.
Yeah, exactly. I think we all get that feeling these days.
Yeah, for sure. And today you're in for a treat because we are going to be taking a deep dive into a situation that has been unfolding really quite dramatically, and that is the backlash that is increasingly being directed at Tesla and of course at its CEO Elon Musk.
Yeah, and we've gone to the trouble of gathering quite a diverse set of sources for this one. We've got news reports from all across the country. We've got some interesting marketing analysis, and we've even ventured into the sometimes murky waters of Unlock's forums to get a feel for what people are really saying out there.
Absolutely. It's it's always fascinating to get that raw, unfiltered perspective.
So what we're trying to do today is distill all this down for you so you can understand what are the core reasons behind this sort of, growing negativity, and what effects is this actually having, real tangible effects on Tesla as a company.
Yeah, and I think equally interesting is, what are the experiences of Tesla owners themselves like? Because, they're kind of caught in the middle of all this, aren't they?
Right. It must be such a strange position to be in.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be trying to give you that sort of clear picture of, how can brand perception undergo such a rapid transformation, seemingly overnight.
And, the relationship between, the consumers and these influential figures who, lead these major corporations.
Right. So where does the story begin?
Well, I think the sort of initial momentum really seemed to gather in Chicago. Reports surfaced of pretty sizable protests that took place on Saturday, March the 8th. And this was right outside a Tesla dealership in the Gold Coast neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we're talking about, roughly 500 people who came together specifically to voice their, anti-Tesla and anti-Elon Musk sentiments.
And the messages that they were conveying were pretty hard to miss, weren't they? I mean, you had signs saying things like, "Make mine a Tesla model, NEIN."
Yeah, and ugly a Nazi car, which is obviously quite a strong statement.
Yeah. And nobody voted for Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And alongside these signs, they were chanting, "Oligarchs out, democracy in." I mean, it really kind of paints a pretty vivid picture of just how much feeling there is around this issue.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just about the public demonstrations. We also heard about individuals like Skylar Damiano, who is a resident of Humboldt Park, and he actually traded in his 2022 Tesla Model Y, and he did this at a pretty significant financial loss.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, his decision really seemed to be driven by, Elon Musk's gesture on President Trump's inauguration day, which Damiano, along with many others, interpreted as a Nazi salute.
Yeah, that particular image has certainly caused a lot of debate. Yeah, it's been a real flashpoint, hasn't it?
And the fact that a suburban dealership actually reported that 9 individuals had come in the space of just 2 weeks and tried to offload their Teslas, I mean, that really speaks to the fact that this is a very personal sentiment for some owners, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's really impacting them at a personal level. And this quote from Damiano really stuck with me. He talked about, the damage being done to the broader potential of electric vehicles and how, his friends were actually embarrassed to even be seen near his car.
Yeah, I can understand that.
And it really underscores how deeply this issue has become for some individuals.
And this isn't just confined to Chicago, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a much broader issue. We're seeing the emergence of this Tesla takedown movement, I think they're calling it.
Yeah, that's right. And it's spreading nationwide.
And reports indicate that on that same Saturday, there were protests at over 50 dealerships across the country. That's right. And unfortunately, these reports go beyond, just peaceful demonstrations. There's been some concerning incidents reported, things like, torched charging stations near Boston.
Really?
Yeah, and even shots fired at a dealership near Portland.
Oh, wow.
There have even been arrests in New York City related to the shutdown of a dealership. So, it seems like this is escalating beyond just, simple protest.
And even individual Tesla owners.
Yeah.
They're being impacted in their everyday lives. There have been accounts of vandalism against Tesla vehicles in Chicago and drivers facing heckling while they're out on the road.
I even saw a report about a note that was left on a Tesla, and it said, "Your car makes you look like a Nazi supporter," which is a pretty stark and direct expression of, what the climate is like right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's a significant wave of, public anger and negative sentiment.
Mhm.
But how is this actually translating, into tangible effects for Tesla as a business?
Well, the most immediate and I guess the most visible consequence has been the really sharp decline in Tesla's stock price.
Right.
It's nearly halved in just 3 months.
I don't know.
So this isn't just, a little fluctuation. This is a significant erosion of investor confidence. And it seems to be directly linked to this backlash against Musk.
So basically, it's wiping out the gains that they saw after the Trump election, which was a time when his influence was seen in a very different light.
Exactly. And it's not just the stock market. We're seeing real world indicators as well. For instance, there's been a decrease in the number of registered electric vehicles in Cook County between January and February.
Really?
Yeah, almost 900 fewer EVs were registered, which is a pretty notable shift.
Yeah, I mean, that's a significant drop.
It is. And then there's the experience of Laverne Canteen, who's a car salesman at McGrath Automotive Group in Westtown, Chicago, and he's having a really hard time trading for and selling Teslas.
Wow.
Yeah, and he even had one that was a pretty new model. It only had 4,000 miles on it, and it came from a federal employee who was clearly really, upset.
Yeah, and I think his quote really sums up the situation quite nicely. He said, "Nobody wants to buy them. No dealer wants to trade for them because you can't sell them. Don't expect to get what you paid for it."
It paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it suggests that there's a real lack of confidence in the resale market for these vehicles right now.
Absolutely. And this isn't just a localized issue either. Kelley Blue Book reported that global Tesla sales actually fell during February.
Oh, wow.
And on March the 10th, the stock price dropped by 15%, which was the worst single day for Tesla stock since 2020.
Wow, so these are clear signals that this is, a much broader market concern.
Yeah, exactly.
And even in Europe, which is a really key market for Tesla, we're seeing a decline in their brand health rating, the YouGov Brand Index, which is a measure of overall brand perception, shows that Tesla's rating fell to Manister 13.1 in February. And that compares to Nagister 2.3 just a year earlier.
So it's a huge drop.
Yeah, it's a massive shift in how the brand is being perceived.
Right. Yeah, and if you look at the sales figures coming out of China and Germany, they are even more alarming. Sales in China are down 49% year on year.
Wow.
And in Germany, they're down a staggering 76%.
That's incredible.
So these figures really illustrate the global reach of this, this challenge that Tesla is facing.
And even when we look at public opinion here in the U.S., the data from YouGov paints a pretty concerning picture for Tesla.
Yeah.
They're seeing the lowest public impression since 2016 with a negative net impression amongst both moderates and liberals, which has resulted in an overall negative net impression of negative 12.8.
That's really significant.
It seems that the only group that currently hold a positive view of Tesla are conservatives.
And even then, it's only around 7.
Yeah. Which is a stark contrast to the average net impression of all car makers, which is a positive 17.
So you can see there's a real polarization there. The general sentiment towards car brands tends to be positive, but with Tesla, it's significantly negative, and this is largely driven by, those demographics who are arguably the most likely to be early adopters of electric vehicles.
So, it seems undeniable that Elon Musk's, actions and his public persona are really playing a central role in all of this.
Oh, absolutely.
How exactly has his involvement become this catalyst for such a strong backlash?
Well, I think his increasing involvement in national politics under President Trump has been a big factor,
Right.
Particularly his role in overseeing, job and spending cuts at the Department of Government Efficiency, which is also known as DOGE.
Yeah, and of course that gesture during the inauguration, the one that many critics interpreted as a Nazi salute, that seems to be a real recurring flashpoint for people.
It's become a very potent symbol, hasn't it?
Yeah, and then beyond that specific event, Musk's work at DOGE, things like, his efforts to dismantle USAID and, his moves to pause funding for environmental and research projects. I mean, these have actually led to direct protests against him.
It's interesting to see President Trump's reaction to all of this. He's publicly vowed to buy a Tesla as a show of confidence in Musk.
Really?
And he's dismissed the boycott as, the actions of radical left lunatics, which really highlights, the deep political divide that surrounds this whole issue.
Yeah, and Musk himself has commented on this, notably with a comment on X, which was formerly Twitter, stating that vandalism is not free speech.
That's right, which, seems to be a reaction to some of the more extreme actions that we've seen.
Right. And then you have organizers like Joe Allen of Tesla Takedown who seem to be aiming for something a little bit more than just, public displays of anger.
Yeah, their stated aim is to actually try and erode Musk's image as an innovator and really highlight the potential negative impact his role in government could have on things like veteran services and Social Security.
So essentially what they're trying to do is connect the negative perception of Musk to real, tangible consequences that could affect a much wider group of people.
Exactly.
So we've talked about, the protests and the falling stock value, but what's the atmosphere like, among the people who actually own Teslas? I mean, it must be a pretty weird and uncomfortable position to be in.
It really is, and it's quite a multifaceted situation.
Yeah.
There are people like Lon Goodman, who has spoken about feeling actual shame about owning a Tesla because of Musk's leanings.
Really?
And he even took his son to one of the protests, as a way of exposing him to these issues.
Wow.
Which I think speaks to a real sense of internal conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have people like Irfan, who's an Uber driver, and he switched to a Tesla mainly for economic reasons. His view was, politics doesn't get in the way of my job, which I think is a much more pragmatic approach.
Right.
But even he thinks that Musk should sell the company to avoid this, ongoing conflict of interest.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then there's Jessica Rabon from Cambridge, who bought her Tesla back in 2023, specifically for its safety features, which were particularly important to her because of her poor eyesight. But now she says she feels uncomfortable driving it because of the association with Musk, and she's worried about vandalism.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how her initial reasons for buying the vehicle are now being completely overshadowed by these external factors.
Absolutely. And then there's Dan King from Uxbridge, who bought his Model 3 back in 2022, and he's now worried about the image that it projects. People assuming that owning a Tesla means that he's a supporter of Musk and Trump, which isn't actually the case.
Yeah.
And he said the main reason he hasn't sold it is because it's paid off.
Right.
So there's a big financial consideration there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then we've heard about, more extreme cases like that of Dr. Kumait Giroje from Worcester, who owns a golden Cybertruck.
And he's faced, actual harassment, verbal abuse being cut off in traffic. And he even found a sticker on his truck that said, "Nazis F off."
Oh, wow.
And he's even received a death threat, all seemingly because of his vehicle.
That's awful.
It is. But it's also important to note that he has received a lot of support as well.
Yeah, and the anecdotes from Seattle are really interesting as well. You have one neighbor who is self-conscious and anti-Musk, and they've experienced negative reactions from other people, being flipped off.
Right.
And their wife even received a Nazi salute.
Really?
Yeah. But despite this, they haven't got rid of their car because of its functionality and the poor resale value.
Right.
And then their other neighbor seems to be completely apathetic, not bothered by the negative reactions and just focused on the performance of the car.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to consider this alongside the statistic that Tesla has actually become the most popular car in Seattle.
Oh, wow.
So it seems that, despite this backlash, the appeal and functionality of the vehicles themselves still holds a lot of weight for a lot of consumers.
I think that's a really important point.
And then there's the whole, I bought this before Elon went crazy bumper sticker phenomenon.
Yeah.
Which is sort of, a humorous but also telling acknowledgement of this shift in public perception.
It really is, and it's a perfect example of the cognitive dissonance that many owners are experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, and then there's the sentiment from the Ariel Tesla online forum, where one user who's actually owned Teslas in both 2017 and 2022 has said they're determined to drive their current one into the ground and give the company as little money as possible.
Wow.
And they cite things like the Nazi salute and Musk's meddling in German politics and his controversial NATO comments as unforgivable offenses. And they say that a lot of long-term UK Tesla supporters feel the same way and are gone forever.
So there's a real sense of disillusionment among some of those who were previously, very loyal to the brand.
Yeah, and all of this leads to a much bigger question about the impact of negative publicity, especially when it's so closely tied to the CEO of a company. And I think the opinion piece by Mark Ritson really offers some valuable insights here.
It does. He makes the argument that while, the old adage, there's no such thing as bad publicity, might be true in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, there are definitely some exceptions, and the situation with Tesla is looking increasingly like one of them.
So he draws this contrast with examples like Corona beer during the early stages of the pandemic or Marmite when they had those price increases related to Brexit. where negative news actually seemed to lead to increased sales.
Right, perhaps just by increasing the product's visibility.
Exactly.
Well,
So what does he suggest makes this Musk effect different?
well, his main argument is that the negative publicity surrounding Musk is so public and it's fundamentally at odds with what the Tesla brand initially stood for, which was this sort of forward-thinking, environmentally conscious, and anti-establishment entity.
Right, and Musk was very much the face of that.
He was the personification of that brand.
But he's now moving in a direction that seems to clash with that image.
Exactly.
And it seems that Tesla's strategy of, relying so heavily on Musk as this kind of walking billboard for the brand without developing a more robust and independent brand identity has really amplified their vulnerability.
Yeah, by making Musk so central to the narrative, they've inadvertently created a situation where his personal and political actions can have a huge negative impact on the brand's overall perception.
And there's that observation from J.P. Morgan that Musk's increasing partisanship is actually alienating the very demographic that's most likely to buy EVs in the first place, the Democrats.
Right, they're the early adopters.
Exactly. And it's also interesting that Tesla itself apparently warned the Trump administration about the potential negative impacts of retaliatory tariffs, even though, Musk was seemingly quite close to the president at the time.
That's a really crucial point. It shows that even with a politically aligned figure at the helm, the realities of business and the potential negative consequences of certain political actions can't be ignored.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the situation is complex, but I think the main takeaway is that this backlash against Tesla is being driven by a combination of Musk's political affiliations and his controversial actions, which have resulted in protests, vandalism, and a significant decline in public perception, particularly among moderates and liberals. And this negative sentiment is having a real impact on the company with declining sales and a dropping stock price.
And it's created this really complex situation for Tesla owners themselves. Some are feeling conflicted or embarrassed or even being targeted directly, while others are taking a more pragmatic approach and are still supportive of the vehicle itself, regardless of their personal views on Musk.
Absolutely. It's a really fascinating intersection of personal values, consumer choices, and brand identity.
Right. And it really makes you think about, how companies can navigate these kinds of situations to maintain the loyalty of their customer base and avoid alienating large portions of it.
Exactly. And what does this case study with Tesla tell us about the relationship between our personal values and the choices we make as consumers in the modern era?
A lot to think about, isn't it?
It really is.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.